Hi there, it's Mrs. Wallace. I know that there were a few questions about creating a really good driving question for the historical investigation, so I wanted to be able to help you out a little bit. Just a reminder that the preliminary proposal is really more of a reading project than anything else. Your task is to kind of find a topic that you're really going to be interested in and then use some of the reading that you do to develop a question. And questions that work well for the historical investigation are actually a little bit hard to develop. We are going to encourage you to use to what extent in the beginning of your question. So try to avoid questions that start out with the word how or what. The reason for that is because all those kinds of questions, the how questions, the what questions, the when questions, essentially create a list of multiple answers, and it's like a bulleted list. We're looking for a question that stimulates multiple sides of an argument, okay? And the type of question that we create will invite multiple sides of an argument. And it also forces a topic to be narrowed down. So get in the habit of using to what extent in the beginning of your question. And let's look at a couple of examples of this. So we'll look at like a way that you might be able to narrow down a really broad topic. So pick something like the American Revolution. Say, okay, what led to the American Revolution? What caused the American Revolution? Something like that as a question is really, really big because the American Revolution as a topic is really large. Even just kind of putting a start date on the American Revolution is difficult. So what led to it is probably, years in the making. Something that might, kind of include a bunch of taxes and the issues of the French and Indian War and what was happening in the Parliament in Great Britain and lots of different things. So we need to narrow. I might think about, I know taxes were maybe part of what kind of generated some of the American Revolution, so I could narrow it to how did taxes lead to the American Revolution. But still, that's broad because there's a great number of different types of policies that Great Britain poses on the colonies, and the topic is still too big. And even just wrapping my head around what caused the American Revolution is really broad. So if I picked one particular tax, I've narrowed at least part of my question. Instead of how did taxes, how did the 1765 Stamp Act lead to the American Revolution? Well, this is a little bit easier to work with because now trying to look at the effects of the 1765 Stamp Act is easier than looking at the effects of every single tax that Britain imposed. So I've got it a little more narrow. But in order to figure out how the Stamp Act led to the American Revolution, that's still kind of a broad leap. So I do need more focus. And remember that you want your question to be measurable. How are you going to know the answers to your question? You need something that you can interpret using evidence that you collect. So I have to be able to measure an answer to my question. So what if we said, how did the 1765 Stamp Act lead to the creation of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts? Okay, this is a much better question. Not only am I looking narrowly at what are the effects of the 1765 Stamp Act, I'm looking to try to figure out, can I measure how much the 1765 Stamp Act led to the creation of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts, okay? The way that this question is worded with how did the 1765 Stamp Act lead to the creation of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts is better because it's narrow, but the how did part is still kind of asking for a list of answers. And we want the question to kind of prompt you to make different arguments. So if we put to what extent in the beginning of the question, to what extent, to a great extent or not so great of an extent, to what extent did the 1765 Stamp Act lead to the creation of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts? So if we imagine that the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts was created for a variety of different reasons, likely including the Stamp Act, I can actually kind of decide is there a way I can measure how much the Stamp Act actually led to the Sons of Liberty? And how might I find that out? I might be able to look at the documentation of the development of the Sons of Liberty, the people who kind of become the leaders of the Sons of Liberty. Were they writing about or inspired about the Stamp Act? What else might have led to the creation of the Sons of Liberty? So to what extent did the Stamp Act lead to the creation? Might be a certain small extent. Maybe there are other things that also led to the creation of the Sons of Liberty. And the question, to what extent, kind of entails that maybe those other things will also be considered in this research project. Okay, so that gives you an example of how you might narrow this. And don't worry so much about coming up with the perfect question for the preliminary proposal. If you propose a question and it is something that I can help you narrow down, you will be in okay shape. But it becomes worthwhile to have a question that is open-ended and measurable and kind of opens up a little bit of an historical debate. It helps make your historical investigation later on a much easier process, okay? To give you examples, these are just two examples of student questions from last year. And these were not necessarily the questions that were proposed in the preliminary proposal. These were questions that kind of came off somebody's final historical investigation, where they've tweaked the question and, whichever. So the first one has to do with Alexander the Great. To what extent did Alexander's military tactics in the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC allow the Macedonians to win the battle? Okay, so this is a question that's kind of saying, how much was it that it was Alexander's particular military tactics that led to the successful outcome in this battle? And this is actually a very large debate amongst historians, because the Persian Darius that Alexander was opposing also made mistakes. So the implied counter argument to this, if it wasn't that Alexander's military tactics really made the difference in this particular battle, maybe it was the terrain and the geography, maybe it was Darius's mistakes. And so each one of those things might be a topic covered in the historical investigation, okay? But the question is kind of worded that maybe we don't really know the answer. You kind of go into this not being sure exactly what the answer is, but the evidence will help the student decide this, particular question, okay? The second one is, to what extent did Johann Tetzel's preaching of indulgences at the University of Wittenberg in 1517 cause Martin Luther to write the 95 Theses and start the Reformation? So this is a question that has to do with the Protestant Reformation, and the student was really interested in, why did Martin Luther start the Protestant Reformation, and why did he write the 95 Theses? And it might be that there are several reasons why he did. We'll assume that it's not just one reason, but the student wanted to know is, to what extent was Johann Tetzel, who was kind of this individual who's pushing indulgences in the area that Martin Luther is spending time in, how much that made a difference. And again, this is a student who would have to discover through the unveiling of evidence and research through evidence to decide how much this particular question, how much this is actually the case. And, for students that pursue a historical investigation, what you ultimately do in the HI is, once you pose a question, you're going to be developing evidence that answers a variety of different answers. So you're kind of taking the particular parts of the debate and putting evidence on kind of both sides of the debate, and then hosting the debate with yourself, and then drawing conclusions from what the evidence might tell you. So it's a process where you have to do a lot of evaluation, because you really propose a question find evidence that might support a variety of answers, you evaluate the evidence and then decide what your particular answer or conclusion to the question might be. It's kind of very similar to a lab in science where you hypothesize and then run an experiment, except the experiment in history is organizing evidence that you can consider in order to make a decision. Okie doke, I hope that was a little helpful, and we'll talk more in class.